Some lives unfold quietly, without ceremonies to mark them. No aisle, no vows, no moment where two futures are bound into one name. Instead, there is a different rhythm, evenings that belong only to themselves, decisions made without negotiation, a sense of space that feels intentional rather than empty. For some, not marrying is not a rejection of love, but a refusal to shrink their inner world to fit an inherited script. They watch others step into partnerships like houses already furnished, while they continue walking, curious, unanchored, awake. This choice is often misunderstood as avoidance or fear, yet beneath it lives something more complex, a psychology shaped by autonomy, memory, self-protection, and a quiet loyalty to one's own emotional truth. This chapter explores the subtle emotional moment when someone begins to realize they may not want marriage. It focuses on recognition rather than explanation, how this awareness emerges quietly, without rebellion or certainty. The chapter sets the emotional foundation for understanding this choice as an inward noticing, not a reaction. It rarely begins with a decision. More often, it begins with a feeling that does not ask to be named. A pause, felt during conversations about weddings. A silence that appears when future plans are discussed with assumed certainty. Not discomfort exactly, more like distance, as if the words being spoken belong to a life running parallel, not intersecting. For many who choose not to marry, this awareness arrives quietly. There is no dramatic rejection of tradition, no manifesto against love, just a growing sense that the story unfolding around them is not one they are meant to step into. They watch others speak about marriage with anticipation, fear, excitement, or relief. They listen closely, waiting for recognition to spark inside them. Sometimes it never does. Instead, something else emerges, a calm neutrality or a gentle resistance that cannot be argued away. The idea of marriage does not feel wrong. It simply does not feel personal. This divergence often goes unnoticed at first, even by the person experiencing it, because society frames marriage not as a preference, but as a destination, something one eventually arrives at like adulthood itself. So when the desire fails to appear, it is often interpreted as delay. Not yet, eventually, after this phase. But time passes, relationships come and go, growth happens, and still the internal compass does not shift. What begins to surface then is not confusion, but clarity. Quiet, uncelebrated clarity. A realization that feels less like choosing a path and more like noticing where one is already standing. This recognition can be unsettling, because it separates the internal truth from the external script. Marriage is presented as proof of maturity, of commitment, of emotional success. To step away from it, even gently, can feel like stepping outside of legitimacy itself. And yet, for those experiencing this divergence, there is no sense of loss, only an absence of pull. They do not feel deprived. They feel unchanged. This is where misunderstanding often begins. Observers interpret the lack of desire as fear, avoidance, or damage. But inside, the emotional landscape is not chaotic. It is still. There is often a deep attentiveness in these individuals, a sensitivity to internal alignment. They notice when expectations attempt to override instinct. They feel the weight of roles before they accept them. Marriage for them is not threatening, but it is heavy with assumptions. Assumptions about permanence, about shared identity, about prioritizing one bond above all others. For some nervous systems, this weight registers as constriction rather than comfort. So the divergence is not loud. It does not announce itself. It is felt in small moments, when imagining the future feels expansive only when no structure is imposed. When freedom does not feel like escape, but like oxygen. When solitude feels restorative rather than lonely. This awareness is often accompanied by guilt, because choosing differently feels like rejecting something sacred. there is a quiet question that lingers beneath it all. If this is what everyone wants, why don't I? That question can take years to soften. Years to realize it does not require an answer, only honesty. The recognition phase is not about certainty. It is about permission to notice, to stop forcing desire where there is none, to stop assuming that silence means something is broken. For many, this chapter of awareness is lived internally, without witnesses. There is no language for it yet, only a feeling of standing slightly apart, watching life unfold from a different angle. Not above, not below, just elsewhere. And in that quiet elsewhere, the story truly begins. This chapter explores the emotional and relational origins behind the choice not to marry. It looks gently at early environments, attachment experiences, and formative observations of love. Rather than assigning blame, it reveals how past emotional climates quietly shape adult preferences. Every preference has a history, even when it does not announce itself. Long before marriage becomes a personal question, ideas about closeness are already forming. Not through instruction, but through observation, through what was felt more than what was said. Some grew up in homes where love was present, but conditional, affection tied to behavior, stability dependent on performance. In such spaces, connection learned to coexist with vigilance. Others witnessed relationships held together by endurance rather than tenderness. Two people sharing space but not emotional refuge. Conflict normalized, silence thick, resolution rare, and some watched love dissolve repeatedly. Marriages that began with promise and ended with quiet resentment or sudden absence. Not dramatic enough to scar, but consistent enough to teach. These early environments do not dictate outcomes, but they do shape the nervous system's relationship with intimacy. For many who later choose not to marry, closeness was learned as something that required self-reduction. Needs softened, emotions managed, autonomy negotiated away piece by piece. Even in loving homes, the message can be subtle. Togetherness is valued more than individuality. Stability is rewarded, even when it costs inner freedom. Children absorb these patterns silently. They do not reject love, they adapt to it. So when adulthood arrives, and marriage is presented as the highest form of connection, something inside hesitates. Not because love is unfamiliar, but because it is deeply familiar in all its complexity. This hesitation is often misread as fear of commitment. But commitment was never the issue. The deeper concern is containment. Marriage, as modeled early on, can appear less like partnership and more like enclosure. A structure where roles solidify faster than understanding, where leaving becomes more complicated than staying. For someone who learned early that emotional safety required self-monitoring, permanence feels heavy. Not romantic, heavy. There is also the influence of early responsibility. Many who choose not to marry were emotionally adult long before they should have been. They mediated conflict. They adapted. They held space. By the time they reach adulthood, they have already lived a version of partnership without choice, without consent. So when marriage is offered as the next step, it does not feel like expansion. It feels like repetition. This does not mean their upbringing was harmful. It means it was formative. Some learned that love demands endurance. Others learned it demands sacrifice. Some learned it demands silence. These lessons do not disappear with age. They become reference points. And so, the decision not to marry is rarely a rejection of love itself. It is a boundary drawn around an old emotional terrain. A way of saying, I know what closeness can cost. I know what it asks. And I am no longer willing to pay unconsciously. There is often tenderness in this choice, a desire to protect connection from becoming obligation, to preserve affection without entanglement. The roots are not dramatic. They are quiet, layered, reasonable. This is why explanations feel insufficient, because the choice did not originate in logic. It grew from lived emotional memory. Memory stored not in stories, but in the body, in how quickly tension is felt, in how autonomy soothes, in how solitude restores equilibrium. Understanding these origins is not about tracing blame backward. It is about recognizing that every adult preference is an echo, not of trauma alone, but of adaptation. And adaptation, once it has kept someone emotionally safe, is not easily surrendered. This chapter explores the psychological and scientific foundations behind choosing not to marry. It gently weaves attachment theory, personality research, and nervous system regulation into the narrative. The focus is on understanding this choice as a form of self-regulation rather than emotional avoidance. From the outside, independence often looks like distance, but psychologically it is something else entirely. For many who choose not to marry, autonomy is not a lifestyle preference. It is a stabilizing force, a way the nervous system maintains balance, a condition under which clarity, calm, and emotional presence become possible. Attachment theory offers one lens through which this can be understood, not as a diagnostic label, but as a language for relational comfort. Some individuals are wired to feel most secure when closeness is flexible rather than fixed, when connection can deepen without becoming enclosing, when bonds are chosen repeatedly, not contractually assumed. This does not always align with the traditional structure of marriage. Research shows that people with strong self-directed tendencies often experience intimacy more fully when they do not feel psychologically merged. They require space not to avoid others, but to remain themselves within connection. For these individuals, autonomy is not the opposite of love. It is the condition that allows love to exist without distortion. Personality psychology echoes this pattern. Those high in self-sufficiency, introspection, and internal locus of control often prioritize inner coherence over external validation. They are guided less by social milestones and more by internal alignment. Marriage, in this context, can feel externally directive, a structure that carries implicit expectations about time, identity, and future orientation. Not oppressive, but prescriptive. The human nervous system is highly sensitive to perceived loss of control. Even symbolic constraints can activate stress responses. For some, the idea of lifelong contractual closeness subtly signals permanence without flexibility. The body responds before the mind has language for it. This is why intellectual arguments about marriage often miss the point, because the resistance is not ideological. It is physiological. Studies on relational satisfaction show that perceived choice is one of the strongest predictors of emotional well-being. Not commitment itself, but the sense that commitment remains voluntary. When commitment becomes assumed, the nervous system can register threat instead of safety. For people oriented toward autonomy, marriage risks shifting the emotional frame from "I choose you" to "I am bound," even when love is present. This internal response is rarely conscious. It manifests as restlessness, as emotional withdrawal, as an unnameable heaviness around future planning. Importantly, this does not mean these individuals lack relational depth. In fact, many form profoundly loyal, attentive bonds, but they do so within structures that preserve psychological sovereignty. They often excel at intimacy that is present-focused rather than future-locked. Connection that is alive rather than guaranteed. There is also the role of identity integration. Marriage, as a social institution, often implies identity fusion. Shared goals, shared timelines, shared definitions of success. For those with a strong sense of internal identity, this can feel like dilution rather than unity. Not because the other is unwanted, but because the self is non-negotiable. This psychological orientation is frequently misunderstood as selfishness. But research consistently differentiates self-centeredness from self-directedness. The former seeks advantage. The latter seeks alignment. People who choose not to marry often fall into the second category. Their decisions are guided by what preserves emotional clarity, not what maximizes gain. Autonomy, in this sense, is not isolation. It is regulation. A way of ensuring that connection does not come at the cost of coherence. Understanding this reframes the choice entirely, not as fear of closeness, but as devotion to internal stability. a stability from which genuine connection, when chosen, can emerge without pressure, performance, or pretense. This chapter explores the emotional contradiction at the center of this choice. It examines how desire for intimacy can coexist with resistance to marriage as an institution. The focus is on inner tension, not conflict to be solved, but complexity to be understood. It is possible to want closeness and still resist the structure designed to contain it. This is the paradox many live inside. They fall in love. They miss people. They long for warmth, recognition, shared laughter, shared silence. And yet, when marriage enters the conversation, something inside tightens. Not because love disappears, but because its shape begins to change. Marriage often arrives wrapped in symbolism, promise of permanence, public declaration, a future mapped in advance. For some, this symbolism feels reassuring. For others, it feels like expectation replacing presence. The resistance is not to the partner. It is to what the structure implies. Marriage can subtly shift the emotional posture of a relationship. From discovery to maintenance, from choosing to staying, from openness to obligation. These shifts are not inherently harmful, but they are felt differently by different nervous systems. For those who value fluidity, love is something that breathes best without rigid edges. It deepens through attention, not assurance, through return, not guarantee. So when marriage suggests that love should now be secure, something precious feels at risk, as if safety might dull sensitivity, as if permanence might weaken presence. This creates an internal tension that is difficult to articulate. On one side, there is genuine longing for companionship, for shared meaning, for emotional intimacy. On the other, there is resistance to role adoption, to social visibility, to being defined through a single bond. This tension is often misinterpreted as ambivalence, but ambivalence implies confusion. What exists here is discernment, a knowing that love and marriage, though often linked, are not psychologically identical. Many who resist marriage are deeply romantic, not in fantasy but in attention. They value emotional nuance. They notice subtle shifts. They invest in connection when it feels alive. What they resist is not depth, but predictability masquerading as security. There is also the question of ownership. Marriage, even in its most modern forms, carries traces of possession. Language shifts. Mine, yours, ours. For some, this language feels comforting. For others, it feels enclosing. They prefer bonds that feel mutual without being enclosing, connected without being absorbed. This resistance can create loneliness, even in relationships, because explaining it risks misunderstanding, and silence risks assumption. Partners may hear rejection where there is none. Friends may hear fear where there is clarity. So many learn to carry this tension quietly, loving fully, resisting silently. There is often grief here, not for marriage itself, but for how easily love becomes misunderstood when it does not follow expected forms. The world struggles to hold nuance, prefers categories, either committed or avoidant, settled or running, serious or broken. But human emotional life is rarely so simple. For some, the most authentic way to love is without contracts, without guarantees that dull awareness, without structures that shift focus from presence to permanence. This does not make their love fragile. It makes it conscious. They stay not because they must, but because they are still choosing. And in that choosing, again and again, love remains awake. This chapter explores the internal turning point where resistance becomes self-trust. It focuses on the quiet realization that not marrying is not avoidance, but alignment. The emphasis is on inner permission rather than external explanation. Clarity rarely arrives as certainty about the future. More often, it arrives as honesty about the present. For many, the turning point is not a single moment, but an accumulation. A series of small recognitions that eventually become undeniable. The relief felt when expectations are released. The calm that follows declining to explain. the sense of coherence that appears when imagining a life unstructured by obligation. At some point, the internal debate softens. The question shifts from, "What is wrong with me?" to, "What am I actually responding to?" This shift is subtle but profound. It marks the moment when external narratives lose authority over internal experience, when comparison gives way to observation, when justification is no longer required for truth to exist. This clarity does not eliminate doubt, but it changes its tone. Doubt becomes curiosity rather than accusation, a space to listen rather than a demand to conform. For many, this realization comes during periods of solitude. Not loneliness, but intentional aloneness. Moments when the nervous system finally rests, when there is no one to accommodate, no future to negotiate. In these moments, the self becomes audible, and what it often says is simple: "This feels right." Not forever, not always, just now. The clarity lies in honoring that. There is also a reframing of time that occurs. Marriage is often positioned as a race against age, a milestone that must be reached before something closes. When that frame loosens, time becomes less urgent, less evaluative. Life is no longer measured by arrival, but by congruence. This clarity can be disorienting because it removes the need for performance. Without marriage as a marker, there is no clear evidence to present, no visible proof of adulthood, success, or emotional legitimacy. What remains is internal, and internal markers are harder to defend. They require trust. Trust that fulfillment does not need to be witnessed, that meaning does not need ceremony, that a life can be valid without public recognition. This moment of clarity often coincides with a new relationship to explanation. Where once there was the urge to convince, there is now quiet refusal. Not from defiance, but from understanding that not everything is communicable. Some truths are experiential. They lose integrity when translated into justification. So clarity becomes less about announcing a decision and more about living it. There is gentleness here, a softening toward oneself. The realization that not choosing marriage is not a rejection of connection, growth, or responsibility. It is a commitment to internal alignment. This commitment is not rigid. It leaves room for change, for future versions that may choose differently, but it does not betray the present self to appease imagined futures. That is the turning point, when the inner voice is no longer overridden by expectation, when the self is trusted to evolve without coercion. Not marrying stops feeling like an absence. It begins to feel like presence. A life lived from inside rather than toward an image. This chapter explores how meaning, intimacy, and belonging are cultivated outside marriage. It reframes fulfillment as something internally anchored rather than socially conferred. The focus is on integration, not replacement, of connection, solitude, and purpose. When marriage is no longer the central organizing principle, something else quietly takes its place. Not emptiness, but intentionality. Life begins to arrange itself around internal rhythms rather than inherited timelines. Days are shaped by energy instead of expectation. Connection is sought where it feels reciprocal, not obligatory. Wholeness, in this context, is not something waited for. It is something constructed gradually from within. For many who do not marry, intimacy does not disappear. It disperses. Friendships deepen beyond convenience. Conversations linger. Emotional presence becomes an offering rather than a role. These bonds are often chosen carefully, maintained consciously, freed from assumptions of permanence that dull attention. There is often a richness here that goes unnoticed by conventional measures, because it does not look like merging. It looks like parallel presence. Two people meeting without needing to become one. Solitude also takes on a different meaning, not as a deficit, but as a stabilizing environment. Time alone becomes a place of regulation, where the self is not interrupted, where emotions can be felt fully without translation. This solitude is not empty, it is generative. It allows for creative work, inner exploration, rest without justification. It becomes a relationship in itself, one that does not demand compromise to remain intact. Purpose, too, finds new expression. Without marriage as an anchor, meaning often flows into work, contribution, curiosity. Not as compensation, but as expansion. There is more space to follow interests without negotiation, to relocate, adapt, change direction, to evolve without destabilizing someone else's sense of future. This flexibility supports a different kind of stability, one rooted in self-trust rather than predictability. Belonging is no longer centralized. It becomes networked, a circle of people, places, rituals, and inner practices. No single bond carries the weight of total fulfillment. This diffusion reduces pressure on relationships. They are allowed to be what they are, not everything at once. There is also grief woven into this integration. Moments when the absence of a default companion is felt. When illness, aging, or silence sharpens awareness. But this grief is not proof of lack. It is proof of humanity. Even the most conventional lives feel it. The difference is that those who build wholeness this way are often more practiced at sitting with absence. They do not rush to fill it. They let it inform rather than define. Their lives may appear unconventional, but internally, there is often coherence. A sense of being held not by a person alone, but by alignment. Wholeness here is not completion. It is balance. A life where connection does not eclipse self, and self does not replace connection. This integration is quiet. It resists spectacle. There are no milestones to announce it, only an ongoing sense that life as it is being lived fits. This closing chapter offers a poetic reflection on lives lived outside prescribed definitions. It explores acceptance, spaciousness, and the quiet legitimacy of unlabeled paths. Rather than concluding, it leaves the listener with stillness and emotional permission. Some lives move forward without titles to explain them. No before and after photographs. No public declarations. No single word that neatly summarizes their meaning. And yet they are full. Lives without marriage often unfold beyond the reach of easy labels. They resist shorthand. They do not fit cleanly into categories that require visible proof. This can make them hard to recognize from the outside, because society is fluent in symbols, rings, ceremonies, shared last names. Without these markers, a life can appear unfinished, as if it is still waiting for something to begin. But inside these lives, there is motion, growth, connection, loss, return. Nothing essential is missing. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes from living without a prescribed frame. Not the freedom of endless choice, but the freedom of internal permission. The permission to let meaning arrive gradually, to let relationships take the shapes they naturally assume, to let identity remain fluid rather than finalized. This way of living does not reject tradition. It simply refuses to inherit it blindly. It allows love to exist without performance, belonging without ownership, commitment without contract. There is humility here, an understanding that no structure can guarantee fulfillment, that no path is immune to grief. Marriage does not protect against loneliness, and solitude does not eliminate it. What determines depth is not form, but attention. These unlabeled lives often cultivate attentiveness by necessity. Without scripts, presence becomes essential. Without guarantees, meaning must be chosen repeatedly. This can look fragile from the outside, but it is often resilient, because resilience built on awareness adapts. It does not collapse when assumptions fail. There is also quiet courage in this path. Not the courage of defiance, but of honesty. The courage to say, "This is how my life makes sense to me," even when there is no language for it. Even when recognition is delayed or withheld. Over time, something settles. The need to be understood softens. Comparison loosens its grip. The life begins to feel sufficient without explanation. And in that sufficiency, there is peace. Not a dramatic peace, a simple one. the kind that comes from not forcing oneself into shapes that do not fit, from letting a life be defined from the inside outward. Some stories are not meant to be summarized. They are meant to be lived. And some lives, untouched by labels, move through the world quietly complete, not because they avoided commitment, but because they remained committed to truth.